So today I want to talk about the history of the ship, the Augusta, the myths that this ship created. Because I think in some cases myths are as interesting as the real history. And there are reasons that we tell stories like this being a cannonball that sunk a British warship. And those reasons are at least as interesting, I think, as the true story. And so I wondered, how did this would end up here? And in this case, this is an interesting historical study where the farther back in time we go, the more we know about it. So we know a lot about the revolutionary history of the Augusta, this ship. We know a little less about how it got out of the water. And I personally know relatively little about the specifics of how it ended up in the DAR Hall, although some of you may know more. I would welcome thoughts on that at the end. For those of you who haven't been in the New Jersey room, we were discussing taking a group over there at the end of the talk, so you're welcome to go along and we'll see it in person. I like to think about the Augusta, this ship, as having three lives. Three periods of its history, three lives, right? The first, it's a British warship. That's its life between 1763 and 1777. The second, it's a shipwreck. It's a shipwreck between 1777 and 1869. Almost 100 years. The third, it's a relic, right? A souvenir of the past. The Augusta's life as a relic lasts from 1869 all the way until the present, right? It's still a relic here in the DAR Hall. So its first life, its life as a warship. By the books, the HMS Augusta would have been a 64-gun, third-rate ship of the line. It was 159 feet long on the lower deck. What does that mean to those of us who don't speak British Navy? It means that she was a large warship, among the largest ever deployed for the American Revolution. She was not a frigate, unlike what some later accounts talk about. Frigates are a smaller type of ship. She's what we would know today as a man of war, right? A man of war ship, a British naval warship. She carried 64 large cannons, so it's a 64-gun ship. And those cannons could fire a variety of shots. Shots used to attack other ships or bombard a fortification or as anti-personnel weapons. And she was home to 500 to 600 men. So a floating domestic world inside the wooden walls they talk about of the British ships at this period. And probably a few women, certainly goats and cats and all number of other things were living on the Augusta. The two illustrations here give you an idea of what the Augusta might have looked like. The one in the upper right are the naval plans, the lines that were laid out for this ship when it was built in 1764, 63. And on the lower left is a distinct ship, different ship, painted in 1794. It's the one on the left here you can see with the tall mast. But that gives you an idea of the scale of a ship like the Augusta compared to little fishing boats or other trading sloops, perhaps. Ships were key pieces of technology in 18th century warfare. So they're engaged in battles, right? Naval battles happen in the 18th century. But ships are also important for blockading ports, for blocking off trade to an enemy's harbors. They're important in guarding Great Britain. Great Britain's an island nation, right? So its navy has always been really important. It's how they think of their national defense, the 1700s and to some extent today. And ships are also really important for transporting goods during the Revolution. So the Augusta served all these purposes. It was launched in 1763 from a shipyard outside of London. It's made as part of the war production of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we know it, which of course is ending in 1763, but it takes several years to build a ship like this. So there's a massive buildup with the war, overproduction of ships. The Augusta doesn't see any war service in the 7 Years' War, which of course is an international, global conflict between primarily the French and the British. So for the next, I guess, 13 years or so, until the middle of 1775, the ship sees pretty dull, what was called channel service. It's in the English Channel. It's doing those things I was talking about, transporting goods, guarding places. And finally, luckily for the crew of Augusta, or unluckily maybe, as we'll find out, in 1775, war breaks out in the American colonies. So all these ships that Britain had produced at the end of the French-Indian War suddenly had a use in warfare. And a lot of them, including the Augusta, were sent to the American colonies to be used there. She arrived in early 1777, I should say. And that's when she enters the story of the American Revolution. So here's the part of America that we'll be talking about today. You can see New York. underlined in the upper left. Those of you in the virtual world won't be able to see this, but you can maybe see the red line right here. Philadelphia down here, and the big red dot is the as yet unfounded Washington, D.C. So that's where we are right there. The ship arrived, Augusta, just in time to participate in the major military campaign of 1777, what was called the Philadelphia Campaign, or what we would know as the Philadelphia Campaign. This was orchestrated by two British brothers, the Howe brothers. One was a general in the Army, one was an admiral in the Navy. And their goal, their ambition, since the British are already occupying New York in 1777, is to capture the capital of the United States, Philadelphia, right? This is the aim of the Great Campaign of 1777. Eventually, as we'll find out, successful. So in July of 1777, a huge fleet under Admiral Richard Howe departs New York City. They're carrying thousands of troops. They're accompanied by warships, such as the HMS Augusta. And the voyage, which tracks this red line down the coast of New Jersey to about here, it's miserable. It's very hot, a lot of bad weather. They run out of fodder for the horses, so right around the mouth of the Delaware, they push most of the horses off of the horse transports because they no longer can feed them or water them. And when they get to the mouth of the Delaware, which is the route up to Philadelphia, right, the Howe brothers decide that the river is too well defended, that this is not a navigable river for a big convoy. So they decide to go down to the Chesapeake, where this line makes this big hook. And they figure they'll go up the Chesapeake, land right around here, in what's now Maryland, and then march up to Philadelphia. Finally, when they get to the point there, right around where it says Charles, they're able to take on more water. Things get a little better. There's a British officer, John Montresor, he writes about seeing crabs that swam to the surface of the water, how excited they are to fish these crabs out of the ocean. And on August 25th, the Augusta, along with all these other ships, lands the troops right at the peak of the Chesapeake, at the head of it. So the British troops move overland, where this yellow line is, to Philadelphia. They fought the Americans at the Battle of Brandywine, marched into Philadelphia on September 26th, 1777, captured the city of Philadelphia. And then they sealed the victory, sealed the occupation with the Battle of Germantown on October 4th. But despite the occupation of the capital, the Delaware River remains in American hands in late 1777. This is because of a number of fortifications along the river south of the city of Philadelphia. And so the Augusta joins a blockade. We talked about the blockade, the blocking of transports right at the mouth of the Delaware Bay here. It's interesting to think about the Delaware Bay and the Delaware River as traffic conduits in this period. You would have seen small shallops, little everyday cargo boats traveling, a lot of large merchant ships. And then in 1777, right, so this is a highway. It's connecting Philadelphia, whether it's in the British hands or in American hands, to the rest of the world. So clearing the river was a priority for the British because then they could supply their city, right? They're not going to be able to bring much overland from New York, but if they can open up the Delaware River, they can ship as much in and out of Philadelphia as they want. So capturing the river after they've captured the city becomes the priority. It's problematic, though, because the river is not wide open. It's filled with defensive measures, things called Chevaux de Frise. These are these giant wooden cribs that the Americans, being aware that the British were contemplating an invasion of Philadelphia, sunk in the Delaware River with these spikes pointed downriver. So that unless you knew where these were and could move around, theoretically you'd impale your ship on these defenses. I think, it's interesting that the other problem with these is that they're so massive, we'll see an image in a moment, that they change the flow of the Delaware River, and that'll come into play a little later because they're moving around the sediment. So even if you knew the Delaware River in 1775, you knew where the navigable channel was. That was not true in 77 because these giant roadblocks had shifted the current, made some areas deeper, some shallower. This is a Chevaux de Frise spike that was just recovered 2 years ago. The Americans struggled to remove these for decades after the Revolution. There are contracts in the Philadelphia newspapers. Please give us a bid. How much will it cost to get these out of the river? And it's still a problem, right? This one is encountered in dredging. It gives you an idea of the scale of one of those spikes, right? No ship was ever impaled on these. It didn't really happen, but it was fearful enough it scared people enough that it was defensive, right? It's the threat of getting a ship stuck on one of these spikes. So in 1777, as this map shows, the Delaware River became a militarized zone, right? It's filled with forts and batteries. The Chevaux de Frise are these lines that you see blocking the river, here, here, here. Here, of course, the city of Philadelphia up on the upper right. It's a war zone in late 1777. And in October, the British fleet, including the Augusta, has managed to cross the first line of Chevaux de Frise. They found a way around this line of cicada, as they're called on this map. And on October 22nd, the captain of the Augusta, Captain Francis Reynolds, he's aboard the Augusta. They're in the river, right where you see the ship right here, in real time, in October, on October 22nd. He looks over at the fort at Red Bay, what the Americans were calling Fort Mercer over here on the right of the screen. And he notices that there's an attack going on. The British have sent a large force of Hessian troops, right, German troops loyal to the British crown, around from Philadelphia to attack Fort Mercer. One of the American forts that I talked about was stopping the river. The other fort over here, Fort Mifflin on Fort Island, those are what the British are trying to capture to free up navigation in the river. So Captain Reynolds sees this attack going on. He decides that, he hasn't communicated with the Hessians, but he knows that he could support them by going in closer and bombarding the fort from his ship. And just as the ship's coming within range to support the Hessians, who were horribly bungling an attack that didn't succeed in capturing Fort Mercer, the Augusta runs aground, right on this spit of land here where you see it. You might not be able to make out, it says wreck right there on that spit. So that's one of the sediment beds that I had said have been changing, right? You can see how the Chevaux de Frise have rerouted sediments so they're pushing out into the river. What would normally be a deep enough area for a ship like the Augusta, maybe 15 feet draft, they run aground. Not an uncommon thing in the 18th century. Ships run aground all the time, right? No radar, no depth finders. So the crew knows what to do. They start unloading the ship. They start trying to pull it out with boats. They think about kedging with the anchor, where you drag an anchor out, you put it, and pull yourself up to the anchor. They know exactly what to do. The problem in this case was that there was a strong wind coming from the north. So it's checking the tide of the Delaware River. The river, of course, at high tide would flow up, and it would get deeper where the Augusta had grounded at low tide. The problem with this wind is that it literally pushes a lot of the water downriver. So instead of having a nice high tide to refloat your ship, you stay on that bed of ground because of the weather factors like the wind. The crew struggles all night to unload the ship. They're within range of Fort Mercer, but it's dark, not a lot of firing at night. They hope they can get it out by the morning. If you were there on October 23rd in the morning, this is something like what might have greeted you. This is a modern artistic rendition and interpretation of what the Augusta might have looked like when it was aground. The ship would have been under fierce bombardment from the forts. There are also accounts that the Americans sent fire ships against the grounded Augusta, so they lit a ship on fire, 4 of them, sent them down the river in the hope that this flaming ship would hit the Augusta, catch it on fire. Perfect. There are also these small American ships called Row Galleys. You can see there are 2 artist interpretations of them here. This is the Pennsylvania Navy in the 1770s. Very impressive. Row Galleys were small boats. They had a cannon or 2. And in fact, you guys have a great row galley right up the road at the Smithsonian Institution. This is the gondola. It's called gondola type of boat, Philadelphia. It sank in the Battle of Lake Champlain in 1777, the same year that the Augusta grounds. And in 1935, it was raised out of Lake Champlain. And some of you might have seen this photo. They literally had to build the Smithsonian around it. They raised it up on a crane, took it in sideways into the building, and then bricked it off. So this is a typical row galley. There's an image up on the upper left from New York as well. It gives you a sense of the scale. But at this point, this is all the Philadelphia Navy can really afford to make quickly, right? They don't have warships like the Augusta. But these little boats are going around taking pot shots at the big grounded warship. Jeremiah Greenman, who's a soldier in the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, he describes what this looked like. He says, "The spectacle was magnificent. To see all at once the river covered with ships, 4 great fire ships in a blaze floating on the water, the island and the main covered with smoke and fire." So at about 10 o'clock in the morning, Captain Reynolds, Captain of the Augusta, recalls later, he says, "I heard an odd crackling kind of noise and found the sides after part of the ship, and above the cabin, all in flames. So a fire catches on the Augusta. I'll get to the precise reasons in a moment. And it spreads very quickly, so that the Augusta was soon, according to another eyewitness out of Philadelphia, laying broadside to aground and the flames issuing through every port she had. So ports are these holes in the side of the ship where the guns are coming out. The cause of the fire is subject to a lot of debate. So Americans at the time, some Americans still today, like to claim that it was a hot shot sent from one of the forts. This is an iron cannonball that's heated in an oven until it's red hot. That one of these cannonballs fired out of the fort, hit the ship, caught it on fire. There's no eyewitness British account to substantiate this. All the British sources I've encountered suggest that the ship caught fire by its own gun wads. So wads are pieces of cloth and fiber that are stuffed into the gun along with the cannonball to sort of add compacted material to it. And this is a pretty plausible explanation because remember we talked about the wind was very strong from the north. The Augusta is lying broadside to the wind, so the wind's coming right on its side. So it's firing guns out at the forts, and some of these wads, burning bits of cloth and fiber, could have easily blown back onto the ship. Pretty conceivable. The logbook of a nearby British ship, the Vigilant, recorded that the Augusta took fire by her own wads, getting among the hammock hose, which could not be extinguished. Hammock that sailors slept in, those would have been rolled up and put along the rails along the side of the ship to add even more defensive measures in a battle. So a lot of flammable cotton cloth right on the edges of the ship. Ambrose Searle, who's Admiral Howe's personal secretary, wrote that the ship caught fire upon the poop deck, by a Marine firing into a hammock, which, being unperceived, communicated to the shrouds and from thence to other parts past prevention. So whatever the cause, the fire spread quickly, and an eyewitness American painting shows us what happened next. The fire had spread to the powder magazine in the forward part of the ship, and it ignited the powder stores. The sound of this was so impressive that witnesses struggled to find a metaphor, something to compare it to. What was this noise like? Continental soldier Joseph Plum Martin wrote a great diary for instance, published in a private Yankee Doodle, really evocative personal account of the Revolution. He says it seemed to shake the earth to its center, leaving a volume of smoke like a thundercloud. Thomas Paine, Tom Paine, he's outside Philadelphia when this happens. He says he was stunned with a report as loud as a peal from 100 cannon at once, and turning around, I saw thick smoke rising like a pillar and spreading from the top like a tree. This makes us think of a mushroom cloud, right? Something we think of as a modern phenomenon, but that's how Tom Paine describes it. The concussion is enormous. So here's a map of the immediate vicinity of the Augusta's explosion in 1777. Here's the site of the explosion. Make it out in that red point. The massive sound echoes up river valleys across lands, and it was heard as far as 50 miles away. In Philadelphia, Trapp, Pottscove, Reading, Lancaster, Little Egg Harbor, Morristown, New Jersey. There are accounts from people being in their houses, windows breaking, things falling off shelves, being stunned by a loud explosion. The Row Galleys, this is an engraving based on that painting. The Row Galleys were so close that the explosion kills several men who are struck by pieces of the ship falling out of the sky. One man wrote he was so near that some of our powder horns took fire and blew up. The horns that they're carrying powder for these cannons in exploded. Amazingly enough, only about 40 to 60 British sailors of the crew of 500 to 600 were killed when the Augusta exploded and sank. It's only 10%. I think most of those were probably wounded or killed in the battle that led up to the explosion. And I think the fire moved quickly, but also slowly enough that most could get off the ship into boats in time to avoid being killed in the explosion. Survivors were picked up by British boats that are around in the area who've been trying to help the Augusta get off of its grounding. Those survivors included Captain Reynolds, who, according to the guy who picked him up, was in the act of sinking when we found him. So I wondered, what are the immediate results of this explosion? The British fleet immediately retreats down the Delaware River. The Americans began salvaging the Augusta for whatever was available. William Bradford, an American patriot, he was stunned when he boarded the ship, the wreck of the ship the next day, and he found evidence of its chaotic abandonment, including, he said, among the rubbish, a great number of clothes, part of their books, etc. They seem to have taken nothing with them but what they had on. I love this quotation because Bradford seems surprised, but I mean, the ship was burning around you. What else are you going to take? The Americans salvaged a number of cannons before the British came back up the river, and John Montresor, very self-satisfied British officer, later reported in his journal that one of those guns burst at Fort Mercer, killing one American and wounding 8 others. He was so happy that this British gun had gotten its revenge. Huge British warship explodes in the Delaware River. Why don't we know about this? Why don't the Americans turn it into a propaganda victory? It's the largest British warship lost during the American Revolution. No British warship larger than this was lost in combat during the war. Seems like an enormous victory, right? And yet, you don't read a lot in Washington's writing about it. You don't read a lot in the congressional papers about it. You don't read a lot in popular newspapers. I think part of the answer is that Philadelphia had fallen. Stunning defeat to the American cause. I mean, think about the Capitol falling, right? When Washington, D.C. is captured during the War of 1812, it's only really the fact that the British don't want to stay here that lets us recover as a nation. When Richmond falls during the Civil War, it spells the end of the Confederate States of America. So a really significant, stunning defeat for the Americans precedes this. So they're still reeling from that defeat. But you could ask, why didn't they seize victory from the jaws of defeat? Use this as a bright, hopeful moment amid all of these bad news stories. And I think it's because up north in New York, just the week before, a large British army under John Burgoyne is captured, surrounded and captured at the Battle of Saratoga. And news reaches Philadelphia of this capture the day after the Augusta explodes. So the Americans don't need to make hay out of a sunken British warship. They captured a whole British army. This is great, way better news. So because of that, as 1777 comes to a close, so does most popular memory, popular discussion of the Augusta. So that's when we move into its second life, its life as a wreck. The sinking of ships in the 1770s, that was the end of the story for most ships. So the Augusta is exceptional because it has these 2 extra lives, right? The wreck continued to be a navigational hazard on the river. It's right in the middle of the river. Even after we won independence, after Philadelphia is securely in American hands, the Augusta is still a problem. In 1793, a small cargo ship ran foul of the wreck of the Augusta, on which she was stuck fast and sunk. The wreck was also a source of profit. One surveyor in 1820 witnessed men whose subsistence depends on the business, who were raising iron cannon, like this one from a different wreck, for the scrap value of the iron. So men would go down and dive, secure something around an iron cannon, pull it out for the iron. The story of the Augusta also starts to evolve in this time period, in the early 1800s. So the Steamboat Hotel, for instance, in Chester, Pennsylvania, has a circular window on its riverside gable. And everyone locally loves to tell this story. They say, this is a quotation, supposedly this window was added after the Augusta's commander, in sheer wantonness, opened fire on the defenseless town and shattered the wall of the building. Definitely not true. Don't tell people in Chester that. Many local accounts embellish the story until it becomes widely accepted that the Augusta had been a British frigate and that it had been sunk in battle with an American schooner, great naval battle, right? And another more influential rumor gains currency, that the Augusta was a pay ship headed up the river to pay off those Hessian mercenaries in gold, because that's all the German wanted, right? This rumor gets people more interested. Oh, okay, it's not just a navigational hazard. It's not just iron. There's gold. Well, in that case, let's talk. Problem though, the Augusta by now is under at least 24 feet of sediment and 8 feet of water. Not exactly something you can walk over and poke around in. So in 1867, a group of New Jersey men came up with an idea. It's based on a similar plan to what this image shows of a different wreck salvage. But that idea was that they would raise the Augusta, find the Hessian gold. Great source of profit. It took 2 years, $4,000 and $1869. And finally, in 1869, they used divers. They passed large cables around the bottom of the hull of the Augusta, what was left of it at least, this waterlogged hull, right? And they connected these cables to small boats like the one you see, with this little diver hanging off of it here. There were diving apparatuses in this time. They're wearing those heavy metal helmets. We think of the classic diving helmet. And they filled those boats with water. And once they connected the cables to them, they called them camels. They pumped out the water, and the increasing buoyancy of the boats pulled up on the Augusta, raises the hull. This project wasn't unusual. I mean, it seems pretty weird to us, but in the late 19th century, people are yanking shipwrecks out of the water all over the place. The Sparrowhawk is found in a sand dune in Cape Cod, supposedly a 17th century wreck related to the Pilgrims. In Lake Erie, they raised 2 1812 warships, the Lawrence and the Niagara, that had sunk during the War of 1812 and intentionally scuttled. The gondola Philadelphia that we saw earlier, that's raised out of Lake Champlain, along with a number of others that don't survive. Today, if the Augusta was encountered as a wreck, we would study it in place, right? Archaeologists would go down and map it and look at it, because we know that waterlogged wood is really fragile. Instead of organic material, water has inflated the cells of the wood. So when the wood dries out, all the cells collapse. So it's really risky to raise a whole shipwreck. But of course, they didn't know that in 1869. They ground the hull in Gloucester City, New Jersey. This is an image of it in 1895. So the hull, there's the keel, and the keelson would have run right down the center of the hull, and then the framing timbers up the side. So it doesn't really look like a warship at this point, really. It's not like a complete hull. Surprise, there's no gold on board the ship. So the salvers try to make hay out of it. They hide it behind a big canvas screen. They charge general admission, but there's only so many people in Gloucester City, New Jersey who are going to pay a quarter to see a bunch of rotting wood. So they quickly abandon it. And by 1905, one person says it's gradually being carried away by relic hunters, piece by piece. A cannon recovered from the hull is fired in Gloucester City patriotic ceremonies until it explodes in 1910. By 1929, the year of this image, more of the hull had eroded, so we're looking north in Gloucester City. Also a great image of autos lined up and coming off a ferry. This is, again, the hull of the ship, looking even worse than it did a few years before. And later that year, the city of Gloucester builds a big retaining wall along the river that cuts right through the middle of the hull. So here's the ship in the 1930s, that retaining wall, high tide compared to our last image. So part of the hull is now underground in Gloucester City, whatever's left of it. Part of it is out in the river, and the exposed part was visible at least until the 1960s. I went to the site in 2012. The shoreline is now littered with old wood from piers, from dead wood that's drifted up. I couldn't find any evidence of hull timbers of the Augusta. Not much of it left. Okay, so that's life 2, right? The shipwreck of Augusta. Life 3 is interesting. It's life as a relic. The hull gradually deteriorates, and the Augusta begins a much more fragmentary life. So there's no Hessian gold aboard, but the salvers recorded that they found a lot of really interesting artifacts in the bottom of this hull. Silver spoons engraved with a coat of arms, curling tongs for a gentleman's hair, a pocket watch, guns, bayonets, some of them fused by the heat of the powder exploding into a mass of iron. They also find this peculiar strip of copper, an inch thick, and it's engraved with the Lord's Prayer and an Edinburgh maker name. I couldn't tell you what that is. I've never encountered anything like that. They find human remains, skulls and bones, and they even find a firkin barrel of butter that was supposedly quite tasty in 1869. These artifacts are distributed to museums and other sites from Philadelphia to Los Angeles. In 1906, a Philadelphia man offered 170 of the ship's cannonballs for sale. And in 1972, a man donated a shovel and a cannonball to Fort Mifflin, which is now a historic site. Meanwhile, the wood of the ship itself became prized relic material. So here's one example given away by a newspaper in the early 20th century. A souvenir from the Augusta from the Oddly Enough column of the Philadelphia Record. Relics like this were common in the early 20th century. Americans sought to, I think, own pieces of the past. They wanted to have a physical part of history, right? And that could be a part of Lincoln's cabin. It could be a brick from the White House. It could be a piece of a ship, like the Constitution or the Augusta. Other locals used the Augusta's wood to carve new objects. One account says the Irish oak was pronounced as good as when it was put together. So they made boxes and crosses and cups and police gavels and canes. One piece, a little book, even ends up in the British National Maritime Museum. A great piece of irony, I think. Here's this piece of your warship that we destroyed. So these become repurposed, right? It becomes a piece of the Augusta made into a Christian cross that you could put on the dais of your church. Some products were even more elaborate. This furniture was carved by an arts and crafts craftsman named Morgan Holt of New Hope, Pennsylvania. It was designed to highlight the battle scars still in the wood. So this stool, for instance, has a number of pockmarks that are attributed to gunshot. And again, not really something related to the aesthetics of the Augusta, right? This is not a cabinet that we think of as being 1770s in style. It's definitely an arts and crafts interpretation. I think also visible in this furniture and a lot of the other Augusta relics is evidence of the colonial revival, right? A renewed interest increasing in the 1870s in early American history, early American design, spurred especially by the American Centennial. So you see this interest in something from the Revolution right around the time that the Revolution is 100 years old. The most impressive example of the colonial revival treatment of the Augusta is the DAR's New Jersey room. And as I said, I don't know a lot about how this happened. I know the bare bones. So I know that in 1905, between 1905 and 1910, two women, one named Ellen Matlock and the other named Ellen Meekum, shown here on the upper left, who were both New Jersey daughters of the American Revolution and their chapter organizers as well. They get the idea of paneling and decorating their state's room using wood from the wreck. I wish I knew more about what was going through their heads. Do they think this is wood that represents a great American victory, that represents the glory of the Revolution? Or do they just think, look, we've got some cool pieces of a ship from the 1770s and we've got to furnish a room? I don't really know. They don't say in the correspondence that survives. They contracted with a man named Henry Lysum of the New York Shipbuilding Company. He's shown here in the lower left, a Swedish immigrant. And they dismantled portions of the wreck. So this is in 1905, 1910. It's right in the middle of those photographs we saw of the wreck. So that's one thing that contributes to it being carried away by relic hunters. And it took 2 years to dry the wood out enough and find a local sawmill that was willing to risk their machinery with all the iron that was embedded in the wood. Everyone was very worried that they'd be sawing this wood and hit a shell fragment or an iron trenail, one of the fastening devices, and ruin their saws. But they eventually get it done, and the oak, according to one report, was darkened by the tides and time, and so hard that it almost turns the edges of steel tools. But eventually they managed to salvage a room worth of paneling, and a number of pieces big enough to make into furniture. This made the news, certainly published in local newspapers that this project was going on, but with the same factual inaccuracies I was talking about, right? They say it's from a British frigate. The frigate was sunk later in the war, or that it was salvaged in 1876 or 1905. They brought it up just for the New Jersey room. A lot of ambiguity about the story. And there it remains today, the largest remnant of the warship Augusta, right across the wall, right, in the New Jersey room. So what can this tell us? What's the message of these three lives? I think first of all, it's that people make history, right? We invent an interpretation of the past based more or less on facts, depending on our mood or our pretensions. And we make mistakes, like when I was told that the cannonball had sunk a British frigate in a battle. But the Augusta has these lives, and it has many different interpretations, right? It means many different things to many different people, in part because those people imbued pieces of the wood or the whole ship with meanings that the British sailors who were on board in 1777 would never have dreamed of, right? Those guys were not thinking about how this would make great paneling for a room. But that doesn't make that any less a significant use of the Augusta, right? It's It's maybe even more important as a symbolic object here than it ever meant to a guy who was pressed into the British Navy in the 1770s. And I think those meanings and the ways people adapted the story of the Augusta are at least as important as the bare facts of the Revolution. So, in other words, stories about Hessian gold and dastardly British officers firing cannonballs into private houses matter. And that's one of the reasons that the Augusta stayed in local memory, why people along the river remembered it, even if it was a distorted memory, while they completely forgot other things about the Revolution, other ships that were sunk, other forts that were captured, because they were able to repurpose the story, right? So the Augusta is an example of how we adapt our history to suit our times. And that's why it's so interesting that what was once a British warship now stands as neo-Gothic furniture in this museum. And I think that's a complicated story that's worth remembering. Thank you.